Thanks very much, Pierre, and thank you all for coming back after tea. So we've toured the poles and Poldark, and now I'm going to take us back to critical metals and thinking about where they might be sourced from in the future. And I'm going to tell you what I think some of the frontiers are, and I might disagree with some of our previous speakers. So I'm going to give you a bit of a summary, perhaps, of some of the work we've been doing on our projects EU Rare, SOS Rare and High-Tech Outcarb. The clue is in the name. I will, of course, be talking about everyone's favourite critical metals, the rare earth elements. So we've seen all this before. I don't need to go through it in detail. The change to electric vehicles, to renewable energies, to lots of new technologies is driving the use of all sorts of critical raw materials. Some of the key ones might be in the batteries, your lithium, cobalt, etc. Copper's been mentioned down here, not normally thought of as critical, but very important. But I'm going to focus on your rare earth elements, particularly those that you use in magnets for motors in electric cars and wind turbines and other technologies. And this is from a paper that we published last year with Francis Wall and David Merriman, just showing that the prediction, and this was done about 2 years ago, the prediction is for electric vehicles to rise consistently, and changes in policy have only made that more likely. And that's going to drive increased demand for the rare earth elements. And of course, we saw this diagram earlier. It's also going to drive increased demand for a whole range of other critical raw materials. And whilst recycling might play a part in providing the supply to meet all this demand, we're always going to need primary resources. We're all sitting here in the Geological Society, so I think we all understand why. So I'm going to focus on rare earth elements, talk a little bit about the main resources of rare earth elements, and give you an idea of where I think those frontiers to development really are for these particular critical metals. So here's a map from Holly Elliott's recent paper showing rare earth element, you'd think I could say it by now, rare earth element deposits around the world. And you can see that there are many of them, and they are all over the world. And some of them are indeed in the Arctic, none known in the Antarctic, of course. And most of these deposits, most of the ones that we know about, and almost all of the ones that we're mining, are hard rock. They're related to carbonatites in the dark blue, or to alkaline rocks in the pink, like up here. Just a few exceptions that we're going to come on to. And of course, as we all know, the other important thing about the rare earth elements is that all the main resources are in China. So when we talk about the main source of rare earth elements for the world at the moment, they're hard rock deposits. The alkaline rocks and carbonatites, really important for the light rare earth elements. So far, so easy. You know, there's loads of these things around the world. If we could just process those simply, we wouldn't care. The rare earth elements wouldn't be critical, but there are lots of issues with these types of deposits. Incredibly complex mineralogy and textures, more than 50 different minerals that contain the rare earth elements that could be ore minerals. Look at this from Lovazero in the Kola Peninsula. Eudialyte there in the pink is your ore mineral. Look at how intergrown it is with all the other minerals. You need a processing flow sheet for each deposit. We haven't talked about this much so far today, but knowing how to get your metals out of your deposit it's important to be able to get them out, as important as it is to understand how they formed. So each rare earth element deposit needs an individual processing flow sheet. Energy requirements for crushing and grinding and cracking those minerals can be really high. And there can be significant complexities if you've got textures that are intergrown, too fine grain sizes. All these sorts of problems can be major issues and really drive the cost, if you like, of your rare earth element deposit. And there can be potential concerns about radioactivity. So are we still exploring for these kinds of deposits? Well, of course we are. And some of that exploration is going on, perhaps not in the Arctic, but certainly in subarctic parts of Greenland, for example. And this map from Gaius shows the known rare earth element deposits in southern Greenland, which, for the reasons we just heard about from Stefan, is a great place to go looking for mineral deposits, beautifully exposed. And here's the drilling a few years ago on the carbonatitos deposit in southwest Greenland, which is still Europe's most advanced rare earth element deposit, despite all the problems we've heard about of it being in Greenland and only accessible by helicopter. But actually most of the exploration for hard rock deposits is going on somewhere else that, again, we haven't talked about much, but for other reasons, maybe a bit of a frontier, and that, of course, is in Africa. Sam Broom-Friendly took this photo on Songwe Hill only 2 weeks ago. They've been doing a big drilling campaign there at the carbonatite there in Malawi. And, of course, there are many challenges that come with mineral exploration in Africa, but also many potential benefits as well. So that's the alkaline rocks and carbonatites so far, so easy if you like. But do we really want to use those as our prime resources of the rare earth elements, or is there a better way? So this is again from that paper we published last year. This is the rare earth element market demand in 2015 and then predicted for 2025. And you can see there's quite a lot of need for the light rare earths, lanthanum and cerium, for neodymium, for yttrium, to some extent for praseodymium, which also goes into magnets. Now, I will have to ask you to look at the paper if you want to see the details, but this is a chondrite normalized plot. I had to have one of those in. And trust me when I say that carbonatites, like Mountain Pass here, shown in blue, are too light rare earth enriched. So they don't meet this kind of demand. They produce way too much lanthanum and cerium. They're not actually the best deposits for what we need. Similarly, the alkaline rocks, shown here in red, they have these very flat rare earth patterns. They might tell you, oh, we've got all the magnet rare earths, but they don't meet market demand either. Not enough lanthanum and cerium, too much yttrium. In fact, if you want to have a pattern of rare earths that meets this market demand, what you need is these low-grade ores down here, which are about the right sort of pattern, just slightly enriched in the light rare earths. And those low-grade ores are what I really want to talk about, and they include the iron adsorption clays and red muds, which I'm going to come back to. But of course, the theme of this meeting has been a lot of what we've heard is about the deep sea and about getting the rare earth elements from deposits on the seabed. And you might all have seen this recently, Japan saying that it's got enormous rare earth element deposits in deep sea muds, and Wycliffe mentioned these earlier, could change the global economy, apparently. Well, I put them onto my diagram, and these are the Japanese deep sea muds, but Wycliffe just showed us earlier on that if you look at polymetallic nodules, or I think in Sarah's talk we saw some of the ferromanganese crusts, they're all very similar in terms of their rare earth element contents and patterns. They're low grade and probably slightly light rare earth enriched. So there's an awful lot of rare earth element resources out there in the world that have these same kind of grades and these same kind of rare earth element patterns. We've heard today about all the ones on the seafloor, but crucially, there are an awful lot of them on land, some more easier to get at. And for me, I think those are the frontiers we really need to be addressing right now. So first example is the iron adsorption clays. Now, most of the world's heavy rare earth elements already come from iron adsorption clays here in South China. And these are basically weathered deposits. This is the top few meters where you've got laterites forming in areas of temperate or tropical weathering and typically forming on granites. There's a lot of granites in the world. You put them into areas of this kind of weathering and you get a low-grade rare earth element ore in that laterite deposit. And then you can recover your rare earths fairly easily by in situ or heap leaching. Why is that? That's because the rare earth elements are adsorbed onto the clay surfaces. They're not locked up in minerals. But the interesting thing is, up till a few years ago, we really knew very little about this, other than they existed, because the Chinese were pretty secretive about it. So over the last few years, there's been more recognition of other areas where such iron adsorption deposits exist, and we've been working on this one here in North Madagascar. And this is what it looks like, essentially. Nice red tropical laterite. You've got your pedolith, and then you've got your saprolith here. And we did some pit digging to try and collect samples, and also collected from road cuts and other natural examples. I'm not going to go into great detail, because I obviously don't have time for that. But Guillaume Estrade and the team at Brighton University who've been working on this did a lot of leaching work. And the standard way to leach the rare earth elements from these types of deposits is with ammonium sulfate at pH 4. So it's not the most aggressive, it's chemical, sure, but it's not the most aggressive chemical in the world. And this is some of the work that he did. And this just shows the rare earths that came out in the leachate at different levels within the different pits. So you can see that it's the saprolite, the sort of lower part of the leaching, of the weathering horizon, that has the higher contents of the rare earths, and the patterns that you see reflect the original geology, if you like. And that's a really crucial thing that we've discovered. The area that we've been looking at is very complex geology that has been weathered, and that very complex geology imparts significant complexity into the weathering profile and therefore into your low-grade ore deposit. And that also gives you, these are percentages extracted, and that's depth down there, and then the different colours represent the different rare earth elements. And you can see huge amounts of variability in how many in the percentage of rare earth elements you can get out by leaching. So there's a lot of variability, a lot of complexity, a lot to be understood here, but fundamentally you can, by pouring ammonium sulfate through either a heap or even in situ through a slope, you can collect quite a lot of the rare earth elements without having to do anything else. And that seems like potentially it's a really good type of deposit to use, but of course it's Madagascar. Now, this is not some area of beautiful, pristine rainforest with lemurs running around everywhere. It's all secondary forest. It has been extensively slashed and burned by the local people, but there are plenty of local people living there in villages. And if you wanted to extract the rare earth elements from those deposits, you have two choices. Either you remove a couple of meters of laterite from a large area in order to heap leach, as has been done here in China, or you pour the ammonium sulfate in at the top of a slope, collect it in pits at the bottom and hope that you've managed to collect most of it and it hasn't gone into your groundwater aquifers, for example. And this is how it's done in China. The environmental regulations are becoming more stringent in China, but fundamentally doing that in Madagascar is going to be quite challenging. So what are other potential rare earth element sources? Well, the answer, of course, is potentially as byproducts. And this is a figure that I stole from Andrew on global production of selected metals back in 2013. Rare earth elements up here, not all that sizable annually. Down here, here are the biggies: iron ore, bauxite, phosphate. I'm not going to talk about iron ore because the world's biggest rare earth element mine, Bayanobo, is an iron ore mine. Most of the rare earth elements we use are already produced as byproducts of iron ore. But phosphate and bauxite, well, that's interesting. Bauxite is processed to produce aluminium. It's one of our most major commodities. And when you produce the aluminium from a bauxite mine like this, you're left with red mud. Here's a red mud lake in Turkey. And that red mud has about 1,000 parts per million total rare earth elements. And there's about 150 million tonnes of red mud produced every year across the world. So that's a lot of rare earth elements. This is from my colleague Ima Didi's paper in 2016, which you can go and look up. And she showed that this resource is more than enough in Europe to provide all the rare earth elements that Europe needs. And in BGS, we've been doing some work on leaching the bauxite as well. This is sequential leaching of bauxites at BGS. You can see with different steps of chemicals, you can get quite a lot of the rare earth elements out. And this is work that's been done by colleagues at the National Technical University of Athens using ionic liquids, which I'm just putting in there just to set up Gowan. So bauxite, loads of potential there. And what about phosphate? This is the Kovdor mine, which is in the Arctic, neatly putting us back to the poles, in Arctic Russia. And igneous and sedimentary phosphates are mined globally for phosphoric acid, for fertilizer, again, all over the world. Huge amounts mined every year. This is in Northern Africa. The rare earth elements are there in the apatite, which is your phosphate ore mineral, and they go into the phosphogypsum waste. Again, like with the red muds, the rare earth elements are in an industrial waste. And if you could get them out, again, you can supply all the world's rare earth elements if you need to. But the problem is, it's techno-economic. Basically, can you make an economically practical, technically feasible process to get the rare earth elements out of either the bauxite or the red mud or the phosphate or the phosphogypsum waste? And the answer is, at the moment, no, despite a lot of research going on. I would argue, and here I disagree slightly with what Ian said, I would argue that that is one of the major frontiers. It's a technical issue around how can we make the best use of the products we already have. So just to conclude, because Pierre is staring at me, we all know that there's going to be great demand for a whole range of critical metals, which includes the rare earth elements, but they're not rare, but we could be using alternative resources, and we have to deal with techno-economic and environmental issues, and those really are the major frontiers that we should be looking at, as well as exploring all over the world and under the sea. And finally, come to Glasgow for SGA 2019 next year. Thank you.